Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session on free tuition policies around the world and what are the discourses around it and how it compares to the realities of implementation. We have there are 5 of us today on the panel, and we're going to go through an overall an overview. And then we have 3 countries that span 3 continents, so very interesting international case studies. So we'll have 4 presentations of 15 minutes each. After each presentation, if you have a clarifying question, that's fine. But we'll give the big questions and comments and discussion for the end and the last 30 minutes. And so we have 4 contributions. So I'll start us with a more global overview of what's happening in terms of tuition-free policies around the world. Then Hector will take us through how it has happened in Chile. Miguel and Sylvie, the Philippines, and then Thandi will take us through. So here's the first. So what I've been calling the free tuition movement is a small but significant number of countries around the world that have chosen to really go against the cost-sharing kind of trends in the world. And in the past maybe 20 years, there are like 13 countries that have decided, okay, so it's not working. Let's implement some type of free tuitions, and that's what we are interested in right now. They are. We will see that they're all on all continents, and there has been really a push in this country to recognize that this is an important policy, and the language of free is very prominent in all of them. So historically, I just wanted to talk about a bit of the philosophical grounding of free tuition as a policy. Because it's been historically like higher education was free, but recently we've gone the other way. No, there has been a lot of cost sharing, but free tuition was based, of course, on the idea of higher education as a public good. So it's bringing benefits to the whole of society. This is based on human capital service, so increasing economic growth due to productivity. It's based on public economic benefits, so more tax revenues, higher consumption, and also social benefits are a big part of that discourse also, that there is more civic engagement, health is better, there's less, etc. So all of this is brought to the entire society, and so as a result, the idea is that the society should be paying for that. Another rationale behind free tuition is to see higher education as a right of citizens. So if higher education is a right, then there should be no barrier to accessing it, of course. There are maybe 2 philosophies, 2 different types of rights that higher education could fit in. The first is the social right. It's a Marshall. So social right says that citizens have the right to live according to the standard of their own society. And with massification, we can very much tell that higher education now is a standard. It also says that citizens have the right to get access to what can make them the best they can be for society, which also higher education could fit within that description. And then there's another right. So higher education could also be seen as a just right according to Rawls' definition. So if some people don't have access to them, it brings inequalities. Very true for higher education. Another point that's put forward by the advocates of free tuition is information asymmetry. So 17-year-old deciding to go to a higher education does not have the full information about what it will generate in terms of positive benefits. They're probably mostly thinking about their career. But as we know in this room, there is much more to that. And the state also knows. And so the idea is that because the state has better knowledge than the students or the individual making the decision, it should be the one really taking on the burden. And the final one, which is maybe the most obvious one, there is equal opportunities and all the discourse around access. That if you want to have equal opportunities, you need free and open access to any type of schooling resources for the citizens. And so you want to avoid that higher education becomes like a bastion for the privileged, and you do that by removing also financial barriers. So what are we talking about in terms of what's happening now? So since 2008, We have about 13 countries that decided to become free. They're the red countries on the map. In Latin America, it would be Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, and Mexico. In Europe, you have Germany, Estonia, and Croatia. In Africa, Ghana, Namibia, and South Africa, of course. And then in Asia and Oceania, you have Japan, Philippines, and New Zealand. And all of that has been happening in the past 20 years. Something happened, sorry. I don't know what. You all remember the map?
Oh, there we go.
No, it's wrong. Okay. Okay. I've also mapped here all the states in the United States that have state level promise. So there's a lot of them that are also at institutional level. This is the ones that have where it's actually a state policy. And I was made aware very recently that I forgot about some Canadian provinces. That will make it to the map too. But what we're interested in right now is more of the red countries. And what I've done is two tables that are probably very hard to look at, but that's where my work is at right now. I've been trying to look at how they came up to be, and then the second table is about how they've been implemented and the restrictions to it. And that first table, what you see is that there are very variation in the coverage that's initially implemented. Some majority will want to make it universal and try to do that. But there's also some, 4 of them, Chile, South Africa, Japan, and 3 of them have made it income targeted from the start. So it's for low income, students from low income family. And then we have 2 countries that have made it 1 year only. So usually the first or last, so New Zealand and Ghana. The main rationale that's put forward in all the discourses and the public speeches is it's access. It's how they advertise it. It doesn't mean that that's the real reason, but how they advertise it, it's mostly a problem of access and social justice and getting those disadvantaged population in the door to education. One exception here is New Zealand, it was more about immigration and making sure that all the domestic students got in so that they were there on the labor market and they didn't need to import skills to some extent. Quite a few, like maybe half of these countries, a little less. The idea of free tuition and the promise that free tuition would become was backed by important student movements. So the student voice here is also very important, and when they manage to organize themselves, where like in Chile, it can actually lead to legislation. And finally, I think the 2 of them are in the constitution, so they were part of constitutional revisions. But maybe the most important part of that table is that the extent to which this is tied to politics and how much these kind of like policies are the results of elections or decided just because re-election is next year, or just made up as promise during a campaign that you have to implement. So it's very, very political, and it's an easy political win, I would say. On the face of like, it's an easy political promise to make. Implementation is another story. And so the second slide is about implementation. It should maybe mostly look at the column. So those are all the things that the countries are grappling with in terms of how they implement the free tuition and who is going to get it and who is not going to get it also. So the most, it ties to the institution and to the student. So firstly, the institution is most of them is going to be for the public sector. And that makes sense because it's taxpayer money, of course. But some of them have opened it to the private. So Chile and New Zealand mostly, and then the Philippines and Japan have private subsidies. So you don't get free higher education in the private, but you get something. So it's still kind of emerging. Then there are some requirements on the part of higher education institution. Interestingly, very often it does include the vocational sector also. So it's institution, it's not university. In a lot of cases, there's some accreditation requirement in some countries, just to check also, have a check of the quality. So accreditation of the institution or of the program is important. And then we have 2, Croatia and Estonia, where it has to be in the language of the country. So that's to probably avoid paying for European students, to be fair. And then in terms of which students have access to it, in a lot of cases, it's citizens and permanent residents. Okay, it's only 2 countries have opened it to international, which is Germany and Colombia. So they're not selected. As I mentioned before, we have 4 countries where it's SES related. Both Chile and Colombia were starting with a universal plan and was supposed to be a step implementation. It's very much stalled in Chile where it is. Colombia is still hoping. We'll see if that happens. In the others, it's more design of the program and intentional design of the program. It's based in a lot of cases, it's a one-off. So it's your first degree and that's it. You're not getting another shot. So if you do another one, you have to pay. And then academically, there is also some safeguards so that they don't get eternal students. So it's about passing a certain number of credits per year or about the duration of your whole study. So usually they do either the standard period or standard period plus 1 year of study is what you will get in terms of free higher education. Anything above that, you will have to pay. And in the cases where there are safeguards in terms of credits or failing, then you usually have to pay at least something afterwards. And there are other criteria in some countries. Maybe interestingly, in New Zealand and Colombia, they include other vulnerable groups like refugees. So a few takeaways from that work in progress, as I said, it's an ancient idea, but it's resurfacing mostly in countries where there has been a kind of high tuition, high aids form of funding before. And so they're really opposing a higher education funding system that doesn't work. It's created mainly at electoral times, election time, and it's based on access to social justice. And there are some restrictions. The budget is a big one, which is where some of them became income targeted just because they couldn't pay for the highest income, who are the most numerous students in higher education, of course. There's some nationalist also trends with, it's not nationalist per se, it's just, this is taxpayer money we're paying for our students, domestic ones. And then it's to some extent, in some cases, it's progressive because you're really thinking about low income students, vulnerable population. But they're being careful with academic safeguards not to be, for no one to abuse the system. So that's it. If you have any clarifying questions for me, now is the time, and otherwise I'll leave the floor. Yes. A short question, yeah.
You mentioned that, summarized that these changes have typically come around with political changes, but I noticed one of your columns was about student movements. So did any of them directly?
Yes, so there were student movement that then led to promises in a campaign and election. Yeah, so there were student movement that influenced very heavily an election usually. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thanks very much. I liked your chart. That was great. With regard to who is accessing it, it does mention in the main, okay, so vocational is mentioned a few times, TVET, but then the criteria at the end is really first degree. So what are we talking about there?
Oh, it's a first degree within, so it depends. Some of them is first qualification. So that might be my mistake in Zoe. So some of them are first qualification and it's clear, and other are first undergraduate degree, which kind of, as you said, defeat the purpose of including TVET, but it would include technological and university of applied science, etc. So it depends.
What kind of move is there to ensure that it's all that we're talking at tertiary? Some of them mentioned tertiary institutions. I'm always really dubious of that term.
Yeah,
because it's really captured by higher ed. It's not really.
So all of these like kind of fine prints of the system are actually really hard to find, and sometimes the programs and whether they are or not eligible, it's really hard to get it. And in some cases, I went through the the rabbit hole of trying to get to see. And at the end, what happens is that they just tell you talk to the director of the program and ask if it's eligible. So it's also complicated how they manage it within. Yeah. I'm just gonna be mindful of time, and we can have a better conversation after. But I think I should take the stand right now.
3%.
Yeah, because you have to. It's the button.
Thank you so much for organizing this panel and the people interested in tuition-free policies. I'm presenting the case of Chile. I think the case of Chile is interesting because it's this kind of new generation of tuition fee policies. I like to describe it as a kind of post-neoliberal innovation, because basically they try to be a policy result to the social critique of marketization. Basically, the case of Chile represent a kind of like deregulated market higher education system that create a lot of critique and opposition from students and also debtors that are against fees and student loans. So the tuition-free policy tried to resolve that. Also trying to reverse some of the negative or unexpected consequences of marketization process. And this is why, along with policies like debt cancellation, student loan reforms, try to solve the problem of markets. This is why I call it like post-neoliberal innovations. Now, the policy was introduced first time in 2016, then became part of the higher education law in 2018. The aims of the policy was, of course, give some answer to the pressure of student movements, but also have another expected impact in terms of access, equity, and fundamentally was an effort to reframe the higher education system from idea that it's a commodity to something like a social right. Also, you can describe it as an effort to, or as a case of market retrenchment, because you have a reversal in terms of the cost transferring that student loans and fees means for students, and also introduce some level of regulation to the market. Just to give you a little bit of background and how try to understand why the policy is important, we have an important transformation of our higher education system in the 80s. That was part of the dictatorship that introduced a kind of radical neoliberal revolution that also affect the higher education sector. Basically, deregulate the provision, also introduce tuition fees. So we moved from a relatively small and publicly driven and funded higher education system to a massive higher education system, mainly funded through private contribution, but also provided fundamentally by private providers. There was in democracy during the 90s and 2000 was an effort of kind of like gradual small reform to the system of the 80s. So this is why the tuition-free policy represents one of the main innovation in the system of funding policy in the country. Just to give you a little bit about the political context as well, this system, the higher education system and the market agenda has been really contested over time. Here you can see the big wave of student demonstration that led to the policy change. However, there is a long history of student activism against the market higher education system. Now, what are the main concerns of a student? Certainly rising costs, upfront fees, but also after studies. There is also a critique of the policy under representation of students, student interest in the policymaking, excessive deregulation with lack of market insurance and protection. So many universities just collapse financially and nobody give any protection to those students. So we have people who never graduate for those students and still are paying debt, and there is no solution to that. And of course, there is heterogeneous quality levels with 30% of the offer not guaranteeing positive returns. How the policy works is something like a grant and a voucher. And this gets a little bit complicated. So you can describe it as a conditional cash transference from the government to universities, but on behalf of student decisions. Students need to apply to the policy. They are accepted by the university. They are accepted by the government as well. And the government pay the cost of that degree under a system of regulated fees and transferring directly to the university. So it have a mixture of grant elements because there's the transfer from the government to universities, but also with a voucher element because the policy respects student choice. Now, this transference is conditional because there is some conditions on the students, but also on institution, and that is the main innovation of the policy. Previously, most of the student financial aids didn't have any condition on universities, mainly on students, on merits. Previous academic effort, and also socioeconomic elements that relatively remain with the tuition-free policy, but all the academics requirements are eliminated, so people can get study for free if they came from the 1st to the 6th decile from the country. And the main innovation is regarding to institutions. Institutions need to have some level of quality. They cannot be for profit, even though the policy include private institutions. And fundamentally, they need to accept a system of regulated fees, which is a powerful innovation in country history, because previously universities can set up their fees as high as they want, and they can offer any kind of degree that they want without regulation. Now, these have a gradual implementation, so the policy started with the 5th decile, have been progressively incorporated the 6th one. Now, this is conditioned as well to the fiscal income of the country. So if the country do well fiscally, we can move to the next decile. What are the consequences of the policy? First, 45% of undergrads are studying for free. That represents 41% of total enrollments. Fundamentally, undergrads, the policy doesn't cover postgraduate students. There's also an increment in public investment in higher education. That was interesting too, because Chile is considered one country with a higher level of fees and relatively small support. So the tuition-free policy changed that a little bit. So now one of the issues is the policy concentrated 55% of the total investment of government in the sector. So that represents 0.6% of the internal GDP, which is quite substantive. So we are spending more in higher education than other sectors, and that is part of the elements in the debate right now. Of course, there's an important reduction of costs. You have significant percentage of students studying for free. That replace other financial aids like scholarships and loans. So here in this graph, you can see the history of the financial aids. As you see, before the tuition-free policy, students used to have a lot of loans fundamentally and some scholarships. Now have changed a lot. And the other was the introduction of the system of regulated fees, which means that there is a commission that set up the prices, the maximum price that a university can charge, and that is the transference of money that they receive. The tuition-free policy forbid institutions to charge any extra cost, at least for the 4-month duration of the studies, which usually 5 years, one. If the students stay longer period to finish their degrees, the university can charge a small percentage. Now, what are the problems with the policy? Or the paradoxes? So there's increasing participation of private institutions, and this is relevant because one of the aims was to strengthen the public sector. The problem in Chile, however, is the public sector, fundamentally, the state-owned universities represent only 50% of total enrollment, so it's a small share. There's also political pressure from the private institution to get the tuition-free policy. So they present a lawsuit against the government back in 2015 that pushed and forced the government to accept it, private institution as a matter of no discrimination. And that is explained fundamentally because most of the students from low incomes are enrolled in private institutions. So the aims of demarketize works partially in terms of reducing the private contribution for some students, but not the private provision, which is still dominant, still concentrating a lot of the public investment. As I mentioned before, there is also a debate about how much the policy cost and how much the level of concentration, how much public investment is concentrating if you compare with other sectors of education, like primary, secondary education. We, as a country, are spending more in higher education than the OECD average. However, the public contribution is still below 50%, which is the OECD average. There's also contested results about equity and access. In terms of access, the policy did not change, did not increase enrollment necessarily because already the system was massified. There is some impacts in equity. A student with tuition-free policy can now access to better institutions that they used to access before. They also can access to better degrees like law, medicine, because it's of course cheaper and somehow easy to sustain 5-7 years of study. And also, this is a policy is highly valued by citizens. So when there are being some announcement that I'm going to explain quickly now, there is a lot of reaction against cutting or reducing the tuition-free policy. However, there is a lot of debate about if this should be expanded or not, or should be reformed. Now, perfect. So in March this year, we have a new government. It's a extreme right government. That main proposal for higher education is cuts. So they want to introduce some limitations in the tuition-free policy. The main one that, for example, include some criteria to not extend tuition-free policy to people beyond the 30 years old, also with people with criminal records. And this is important because this happened just after a small student protest against one of the government's officials happened in a university. So the government answer was, okay, we're gonna exclude people involved in criminal activities from tuition-free policy. They also want to frozen the expansion to new institutions. That has been debated, particularly because all the public sector is already in the policy. However, some private institutions are not, and they want to frozen, so they keep, they avoid continue the expansion and concentrated public investment. And finally, they want to increase the criteria to the expansion of the next decile. So the idea is just cut a little bit and finish, end the promise of universal tuition free with a progressive implementation and keep it as it is, excluding some people. So that is more or less the situation right now. The government, this is part of a larger austerity agenda in the country, and also is part of other kind of measures, like, for example, enforcing student loans repayments, which is also an issue that I'm not discussing today, but if you're interested, tomorrow we have a session on what happened with the student loan reforms of the previous government. So that is more the status of the moment of the debate. We don't know if these policies will happen or not. Some of them are being debated this week, so hopefully soon I'm going to have some updates to share. Thank you very much.
Is there any clarifying question for Hector with the PC? So fine.
Okay, so we're talking about the Universal Access to Tertiary Education in the Philippines Act that was implemented in 2017. And I should say this was a completely accidental research project. Miguel invited me to the Philippines on a research project in 2017. We intended to study something completely different. All anyone could talk about was the prospect of the Free Tuition Act being implemented, very understandably. So we pivoted our research to explore this. A little bit of background, if like me, you weren't very familiar with the Philippines. It's geographically very dispersed, with 2,000 inhabited islands. It's ethnically and linguistically very diverse as well, with a relatively low GDP per capita of around $14,000. So there's quite a lot of poverty still in the country. With a relatively high tertiary GER enrollment rate of 47%. One of the interesting aspects to me is that, like Chile, there is a constitutional commitment to supporting private businesses, which includes supporting private higher education institutions. This will become relevant later. At the time, also, a significant reform was happening in the K-12 education sector, involving conversion from a 3-year high school norm to 4-year high school norm. Again, that's going to be relevant later, so hold on to that fact. This was fully implemented in 2017-18, coinciding with the Free Tuition Act. A couple of things about the government. The Philippines is a constitutional republic with a bicameral legislation, very similar to the United States. It's got a multi-party system with major, minor, regional and special interest parties. It's really not defined by a left-wing, right-wing binary, and that's really important to bear in mind in terms of the passing of the Free Tuition Act. It's characteristically more defined by personality and patronage rather than by left-wing, right-wing. And so what was striking was that when we started to explore the Free Tuition Act, as it was initially called, we identified 73 different legislative texts. So senators and congressmen had proposed 73 different instances of some version of free tuition or universal scholarships, which to me was fascinating. That's so much legislative activity, and all of them with different discourses, different rationales and justifications for why this should be implemented, and also very different takes on who should be included and who should not be included. So some of them were targeting very specific minority groups, even down to the level of children of fisher people and specific minority groups. And then there were other interpretations that were much more at the universal level. So what ended up getting passed after all 73 legislative texts and the process of committee review and consolidation before being eventually signed into law by President Duterte, I think a couple of weeks after we left, wasn't it? Was the Universal Access to Quality Tertiary Education Act. What it did was it enabled all eligible Filipino students enrolled in undergraduate courses leading to a bachelor's degree in state universities and colleges, so public education, local universities and colleges, and technical vocational schools. Everyone in that category would be exempted from paying tuition. The tuition fee was provided directly to the college or university. But it also covered a subsidy after distinct pressure from the private higher education sector for those enrolled in private higher education. Because of the geographic dispersal that I mentioned earlier, the cost of attending higher education is very different if you're in Manila compared to if you're in a very small town. And in fact, you may only have the option of a private higher education university, depending on where you're located. So the relevant amount of subsidy is pegged to the closest public higher education institution. So whatever that public higher education charges, that's the level of subsidy provided to the private higher education institution. The law also included provisions for student loans, which existed before, but they were encompassed and renewed within this act. That's called the UniFast system, as well as additional subsidies for low-income students who are on a national list, which is called the Listahan, who receive a tertiary education subsidy that's to help cover accommodation, subsistence, travel, and so on. And what we did in our original paper from 2018 was look at the discourses that surrounded the justifications for introducing this.
Thank you, Sylvie. And just something that I learned from Ariane's presentation as we were preparing this, and I think which hopefully we can explore further, and which I realize now makes our study hopefully a little bit more interesting, was that this wasn't an election promise. So the Philippines is one of the few countries where this wasn't presented as a vote for me, vote for then President Duterte. His promise was to basically massacre all the drug dealers in Manila, and that's what got him elected. He's in The Hague now, being tried for other things. But anyway.
But can I add that not about the drug dealers, just to say that there was a congressional election cycle in 2019.
Okay.
So while it didn't coincide with the presidential election cycle, the implementation happened just a year before all the Congress people who proposed those bills were getting re-elected. So there was perhaps some incentive.
Perhaps. Anyway, so this strong man presidency and, also affected the ability to pass legislation. So in any case, I think we thought that this is a really interesting thing to study. I think methodologically, hopefully, this was the research that we did. And towards the end of the presentation, we've done a review of the impacts. So that wasn't our direct research, but that's kind of research that others have done. But the research that we did was to look at these legislative texts and try to see, why did they propose this? As I mentioned, in general, for the presidential election, it wasn't really promised. Why did it happen? And as you saw from Ariane's map earlier on. It's the only country in, I would say, like Southeast Asia, and Japan and New Zealand, which are the other countries that passed this, are relatively rich countries. And why do we find this relatively poor country, right, like implementing free state education, even though the Constitution, as mentioned, protects things like private education? So we looked at that, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the discourse about quote unquote social justice was the overarching finding here. And we have this article, Understanding Issues of quote unquote justice in quote unquote free higher education in the Philippines. And we looked at that justice perspective to see how this legislation was passed. We'd drawn on Fraser and concepts of procedural and distributive justice. And the sense was really that, oh, this was in an unequal society, probably a good way of framing this policy and getting it through, to say that, okay, free higher education was really a very, very strong form of distributing, for instance, resources from, say, people who live or work in Metro Manila to children of fishing villages in rural Philippines. There was an attention to procedural justice. This is more varied, but the overarching, as I mentioned, discourse was about distributive justice. The other thing that was mentioned as well was the narrative of, okay, the Philippines needs to become a knowledge economy. At the time, I think linked as well to the fact that this was passed without being an electoral promise, was that there was some fiscal headroom. The Philippines had been growing and to some extent still is experiencing relatively rapid economic development at the moment. So that fiscal headroom was linked to a discourse around, like the Philippines being integrated into a kind of knowledge economy. The Philippines is an exporter of, shall we say, low to middle value knowledge services, right? Like as backroom offices or back office business process outsourcing hubs for other countries. So we looked at that in terms of this, like discursive analysis of these legislative texts to find out like why it was passed. So that's the research that we did. We invite you to read the paper. We think it's really interesting, particularly from a methodological perspective of analyzing every legislative text that was linked to how it got passed, to go to the point that it wasn't only about economic numbers, but it was about how discursively it was presented to lawmakers and to the general public, and to how it was passed, despite, again, I think there were concerns from the private sector and other stakeholders that felt that, okay, this, like the usual challenges that you have in policymaking that were like trying to point out problems in the bill. But now Ariane also encouraged us to talk about the impacts. This isn't our direct research, but this is a kind of review of the impacts that have done since then. And Sylvie will, I think, talk a little bit about the caveats of these studies and impacts, given the reforms in the K-12 and the COVID pandemic, which may skew some of the items. But in general, the sector, there was increased massification. There are 3.5 million Filipinos in higher education now, and 2 million are being supported by this free tuition in state universities and colleges. There was an expansion in the state and university sector. So obviously the part of the sector that's being supported by the government expanded. In fact, there was a 75% rise in the first year in enrollments in state and university colleges. And I think to think about, and there was this exodus, so they just didn't come from nowhere. There was this exodus from the private sector to the public sector. I guess you would expect that when the incentives were tilted that way. So the institutional behaviors were such that the private universities, as I mentioned, there are numerically more private universities, but at that point, it was about 50-50, right? Like, I mean, the majority were being, around half were being educated in the public sector and half in the private sector. That's since shifted now to the public sector. But private universities focused more on employability, strong outcome areas, and the state universities focused on low-cost delivery areas. And these strategies have impacts on outcomes for the students. So basically, those who went to private universities ended up in higher-paying jobs, while state universities expanded provision in low-cost delivery areas, which don't necessarily have good employability outcomes. And the best state universities, which still had good university outcomes, became much more selective in their admissions process. So the overall message there in the middle regarding individual outcomes and social mobility is that the changes are not having the social mobility outcomes that were envisioned, right? Like this massification is not leading to poor students from poorer families to getting better jobs or better social mobility. It's students from richer families that either go to the best state universities because of the competitive procedures, or to private universities that had now really switched to very, very good employability pathways. Just because of time. So the financial sustainability question. So obviously this has created a big sustainability question and a budget funding gap to the tune of 12 billion pesos. So as I mentioned, President Duterte at that time, right, pushed this through Congress at a time when I think there was much more fiscal leeway. There are question marks regarding that fiscal leeway now. Despite the, and just to mention though, that even though there's that funding gap, there continues to be widespread public and legislative support for the policy. So I think we just want to caveat this with, as I said, it's not our research, but this is an incomplete picture. These K-12 reforms, this adding an extra year that happened in around that time, meant that it's not entirely reliable to look at the the year-to-year comparisons, and then COVID also might introduce some difficulties in interpreting that data. We've mentioned these critiques that are focused on individual social mobility, even though, of course, as we said in our analysis, the legislative texts were about general inclusive development and the Philippines, positioning the Philippines as a general knowledge economy. And ultimately, we feel that the evaluation of really the impacts, just to your question, Ariane, will probably take a little bit longer than what we have, but we're on it, hopefully. Did you want to add anything to the caveats and conclusions?
No, just to emphasize that if we're looking at whether this policy has been successful in shifting the Philippines into a knowledge economy and an inclusive development perspective, I think we would have to be looking at a 20 to 30 year time frame. And it's true that the emerging evidence in the 5 to 10 years since implementation is not very positive in terms of social mobility. That doesn't necessarily undermine the other justifications that were provided in the wider narratives.
Thank you.
Cautious optimism.
Question at this point? Yeah.
Thanks, Lynn, for bringing to the fore the very issue of outcome and linking it up with access. Personally, for India, that access is a necessary condition. Unless it is linked to the question of quality, what does access mean? Now, here, the public-private divide that you talked about is very, very important. Now, what I found for Chile, 55.9% of public investment was getting concentrated on grants and the voucher system that we elaborated upon. Now, if there is an overall fund cut, and then we are keeping the tuition fees, moderate level of virtually zero, then the quality issue is very, very important. And the second observation I'd like to make.
I'm sorry, this is just a clarifying question. We have a debate after. We have 30 minutes. So if it's just short and about
one or two sentences. I have found that the tuition fee, if it is kept low, can affect the seriousness of the student. And therefore, the society may oppose that, an overall lowering the tuition fees across the board, across the stream, may not yield the desired result. Thank you very much.
So I was just wondering about the thing that you said about the higher quality state universities are more selective, but then it's also still the rich students who are getting selected into it. Why is that? Because there is no tuition fees either way, right?
They become more selective in terms of the admissions procedures, normally via a admissions test, and it's students who go to quote unquote better schools, and in the Philippines this includes better private high schools that do well in those admissions tests, including for the state universities and colleges.
Thank you.
And we'll maybe discuss the issue of low quality, high quality related to cost in the general debate.
There is widespread public support for the free tuition.
Thank you.
Thank you, Salman. Thank you.
Okay.
And they've put all the references there. How amazing is
Which
it?
which you can't read obviously with this font, but anyway.
It will be up on the website, I'm sure. It's fantastic. So I'm not really at the university. I need to just clarify. I just disclaim that I'm not really at the University of Johannesburg anymore. So I spent 3 years as an associate professor at UJ. I am now back. So all the things I've been writing about, which I'm not sure which hat I'm putting on today. I'm now the bureaucrat responsible for dealing with the problems that I've been talking about. So I'm working back in government as in the university branch, and oversight of the student financial aid scheme is now one of my major responsibilities. And it was before I went into academia, and it is again, but I just need to clarify. So I'm not really, I'm sort of speaking as an academic, but I'm an academic who's trying to learn how to be a bureaucrat again. Therefore, I need to be a little bit more careful about what I say. So I'm trying to we'll see how it goes. So, I mean, the free tuition policy, which in South Africa, which is quite famously linked to fees must fall, is really about dealing with the racialized and class inequality that we have in our higher education system, which is still really profound. So the policy is really about trying to ensure that people who get access to university are people who should be accessing university, and TVET are doing so despite their financial situation. So it's really about redress and social justice. We still have that happen? I'll stay very far away from the computer. So early post-apartheid legislation focused very much on the need for financial support to assist with access and success. What we had leading up to Fees Must Fall, which was in 2015 and 2016, was a situation where university costs were rising quite dramatically and becoming more unaffordable. And the funding that government was providing wasn't matching the massification growth in the system. And so we had student protests, which I think are quite famous around the world and sparked all kinds of other protests. To be honest, those protests were largely driven by students who fell at the time outside of the free tuition provision that was already in place. So what we famously call the missing middle, which is a hugely a very large group of very, very different socioeconomic groups. So people who don't get free education, but also people who can't afford to get bank loans and that kind of thing. But largely also quite middle class students as well, protesting the high cost of higher education, and really also signaling at the time quite a big lack of trust in higher education, because the focus wasn't only on fees and a lack of access, but also on curriculum change and the feeling that we needed a decolonized higher education system, and the feeling that universities weren't transforming fast enough. So we had a number of commissions and investigations. To be honest, we had several of them before Fees Must Fall. We've had a number since. We even had a judicial commission on free higher education. And before that commission reported in 2017, there was a whole lot of work done within government around what would be feasible. The main finding of the judicial commission, as in every single finding before, was that we need a combination of tuition free for the poor and income contingent loans for others. However, the former president announced in December 2017 that we would have a fully subsidized free higher education policy for all students who fall within the financial 350,000 Rand fee income. And I'm should have put that into US dollars for you because it's an international audience, but it's a relatively low threshold. It's really the poorest of the poor, but it was a higher threshold than we had before. And what he also announced is that it was fully subsidized. And this wasn't even linked to national elections. This was linked to the internal party elections that were happening the day after, in which the former president was actually ousted as the head of the party and then later ousted as the national president. But however, the free tuition policy remains one of his legacies. And for those of us that are dealing with it, it's extremely complex. So very aspirational discourses, but what it didn't do is change the cost sharing arrangement. So we still have a tuition fee. Universities are still linked to tuition fee payments. But a very strong redistributive argument in terms of who should get access and how people should access higher education. So I've already kind of said this is not really a free tuition policy because we do not have free tuition. Universities charge fees. They charge very different fees because of historical legacies. It's extremely complex picture. The state pays fees for approximately 62% of undergraduates, which is huge. The initial modeling was done on the basis that 40% of undergraduates would be. So from the very beginning, there was higher demand than was actually budgeted for. But it has been a profound equity tool in the sense that students who are supported through the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, which is the entity that runs the funding, are doing extremely well in relation to the average student. So we have lots of evidence that shows that financial support actually is really important. And in fact, we have evidence that the previous financial model, which was basically a bursary loan model, primarily a loan model income contingent with some bursary conversion if you do well, that also supported student success quite well. But the difficulty has been really about the high dependence on institutional support in the sense that it's not just something that can be implemented by an agency, or perhaps we have an agency that really is struggling to operate effectively. But we have to work very closely with the universities and the TVET colleges to make it work. And that has been of very mixed success. In fact, it's quite often been unsuccessful in many, many ways. And we've had to have constant policy shifts within the policy. In fact, one of the things that makes it difficult is that we don't actually have a policy document that says this is the funding policies. We have the statement of the president and then the budget documents and then the kind of policy documents of the financial aid scheme, which change on an annual basis. And we also, by the way, which we keep forgetting, we also have a situation where we increased value-added tax as a country in order to pay for this. So it's less supported, I would say, by the public than it used to be. Although at the time that it came in, it was very highly supported. But I think people are a bit skeptical now in the public domain. This shows you just how seriously our student financial policy is driving our higher education policy. Because what it does is show you that the blue line are the block grants, which is the key funding support from higher education. And as a system, we're about 40% dependent on that. Universities are about 40% on average dependent on the state subsidy and about 35% dependent on fees, and the rest is other sources of income. But you can see the student funding budget, which is the orange line, has been growing and growing and growing. And so we've had the fastest budget growth in government in the higher education sector, even against the growth in the basic education sector. And then at the same time, the value of the block grant going to universities has gone down. So we're putting as much money into individual student financial aid to support students to go into universities as we are to support the institutions that they're going into. So this has all kinds of, problems. And then this shows you the level of unaffordability. So this is what we've had. So 2011 up to about 2016, you can see it's a relatively stable growth in the budget. And this is when the budget starts going up, when we introduced the new model from 2018 onwards. But what you can see is that after fees must fall, we took money from the National Skills Fund, which is meant to support the skills development for the unemployed South Africans. who never will ever get a chance to go to university. And we took money, 5 billion rand, to support that, to support the no fee increase in the university sector. Then we reprioritized money for the new scheme in 2018 and 2019 and 2020. Universities received massive additional increases, and the increase to the fiscus has been growing and growing in the student financial aid area. But we also reprioritized funds just after COVID because of COVID cuts and because of the unaffordability of the scheme. So we've consistently taken money from other parts of government expenditure in order to support this unsustainable scheme. And partly why it's unsustainable is that it supports both tuition fees in a relatively unregulated tuition-free environment, although we have informal tuition-free regulation in the sector, but it also supports students to access accommodation expenses. And one of the biggest problems has been in the accommodation space. Sorry, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay, cool. So I mean, we have a massive unemployment problem in South Africa for young people, but if you're a graduate, you're less likely to be unemployed. Of course, we have a lot of people blaming universities for this, but actually it's the state of our economy primarily. Universities are not really the problem, but we do have relatively low participation rates for what is a middle income country, about 25%. But we still have problems. So very few people get access. So if you do get access to university, you really are in a relatively small elite group of young people. And so it's quite difficult. But I just want to say that the private student housing market has probably been the biggest sort of unintended consequence. So about 50% of the funding that I've shown you has grown so much. About 50% of that goes towards tuition fees. Therefore, it makes its way back into the public university system in terms of supporting the tuition fee payments to universities. But what's happened is that undergraduate debt has also risen at the same time. So we have a situation where and it's not national debt, it's university level debt. So universities are absorbing the debt of students, and most of that gets written off. So they're also losing tuition fee income from debt. Some of the debt is unresolved reconciliations between the financial aid body because of the way in which it's been implemented and the universities. And some of it is, I think, that people are actually really choosing not to pay for higher education. But as a society, we haven't really worked out how to find out about that. So it's a difficult issue to talk about. But it really doesn't make sense that as we've been pouring more and more money into higher education access, that we've also been having such huge levels of debt. So there is some evidence that people are choosing not to pay. The problem for universities has been massive because it's lost tuition fee income. When I say opportunities to loot, we call it eating, where people it's their turn to eat. It basically the private accommodation market has grown enormously because the funding on this scheme supports students to access accommodation. So accommodation, like other countries that have planned for this, is something that you can get loans for, or you can but we provide free funding for student accommodation. So it has caused enormous problems, and luckily some of this stuff is starting to come out, but it's going to be a massive problem to try and reverse it. And the point about the social support system is really that we have one of the most unequal societies in the world, and yet students actually receive more funding to support access to higher education than other people do through social grants. And so it's also distorted the social grant system quite a lot, because a lot of students are supporting families that don't have any income. Therefore, a lot of the funding that students receive is also going back to provide social support to families rather than to provide students with adequate food, for example. So we have a conundrum where we have student hunger in universities, even though we're providing this massive amount of support. And I think it's time to move back. But just to say, I think what we basically have an unsustainable model, and you can take that from the horse's mouth. but it is in the public domain that we have an unsustainable model, and how we get it to be an affordable one is really going to be up to the strengths of the politicians to be able to actually move us to something more sustainable. And we really need to think about how we manage an income contingent loan system when we've created a situation where people are unwilling to pay for higher education, let alone for the many who are unable to pay. So we have this kind of paradox of and like many of my colleagues have talked about, a very marketized higher education system. And of course we have growing private higher education as well, alongside this excessively social welfare based system, which is not affordable. So we have really constrained tensions, both fiscally, which is like a big part of what I have to do, but also ideological tensions as well. And we haven't resolved the debate about public-private good in higher education because people are still paying tuition fees. So we don't really have free higher education. We have tuition fee-based cost sharing. But I think the real challenge for us is, both as government but as South Africans, is how do we not reject the core intent of the policy, which is to make sure that there's equitable and redress-based access to higher education. But how do we do it in a way that's affordable for future generations? Because at the moment, we're really messing it up in terms of practice. But to say that a lot of students do get support on this program, and it does work for many, many students, despite that. And I think I went over. No, that's the one. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna push into the comments now. We have a good, nearly 30 minutes. Thanks for keeping time. Chris, there.
Thandi, I was wondering if on one of your slides you had the NSFAS rising allocation of funding. Is that grants, loans, or a combination of both?
So sorry, I should have been right. Absolutely all of it is grants.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have absolutely zero money coming back into the system anymore. So there's no regenerative funding for future generations, which is why I'm particularly worried about how we would reintroduce a loan-based model when people are choosing not to pay for higher education. In fact, a lot of people are saying to universities now, you need to give certificates to all students who have debt, because universities have only one mechanism to try and collect student debt from those who can pay, which is to not release the final degree certificate. All universities will release a statement of results, and they will allow students to get a certificate of completion so they can access employment and further study. But none of them will release the final degree certificate until you've paid debt. But there's a very strong movement to try and get universities to release degree certificates, regardless of people's debt situation. So we have created a culture of, why should we be paying for higher education? And I can only say that in this audience. If I say it, I have to think about it really carefully before I say it, because it's a really, really complex set of issues.
Yes. Thank you so much. It was an outstanding panel, very well organized. I teach here comparative international education, and I loved how you presented all of those cases and how we could locate these cases on the broader map. So I think it's an exemplary panel, so thank you. I'm a higher education person at the same time as comparative international, and I did my doctorate on higher education access in Georgia 14 years ago. And I have thought about that for a long time. While I do not do research in this area at the moment, this is something that the topic closest to my heart. And when I think about it, and when I teach more broadly outside higher education as well, I really, really come to the conclusion that equitable access to higher education actually is outside higher education. It goes back to secondary and primary education. And when I speak with larger kind of philanthropies and international bodies, again, I have to actually ask for more attention to lower levels of education in order to support equitable access to higher education. So my question now is, what are other policies and initiatives that governments can implement or might have implemented already, especially in Chile maybe and in South Africa, because it's not universal
free education in this context, unlike Philippines, where it's universal free education from what I understand. But even in Philippines, the brightest people take up those best places. So what are parallel policies, especially more positive discrimination, affirmative action policies, or some other policies related to support initiatives for students in the first year or preparatory courses that are there that can really ensure equitable access? Thank you.
You want to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, well, the tuition-free policy was part of a larger package of educational reform. In terms of access, there was this initiative called the FATE program, which is to give you a combination of quotas to access to higher education institutions with training program. So if you are part of that program, your school is connected to one university, and the university also started like a pre-working process of accessing the institution. And then when you are in the university, you have extra support because any kind of academic gap of your skills. That started as an experimental program in a couple of universities and became a national policy over the decade. It's good in terms of like it's reducing dropouts rate and increasing diversity, and it matches really well with the condition of access that the tuition-free policy requires from institutions. So I didn't talk too much about that, but the tuition-free policy also requires from institutions to have a widening access policy. So that is not the problem with that program is relatively limited to a small percentage of institutions, and also rely a lot of investment from the institution itself. One of the issues that is happening around this debate is universities complain that the regulated fee that they get from the tuition-free doesn't cover the cost of teaching, and teaching students from low income backgrounds is harder for them as well. And the PASSER program also requires more investment. So this is why some institutions are not against the tuition-free policy itself, but they are against the fee regulation, and they are demanding payments so they can match what they say is its cost.
I don't know if it directly answers the question, Mai, but I was just thinking, so what is higher education a case of then? Is it different from secondary education? I guess it's partly the question in terms of social access. And this protection of private education. So I just think again, those elements are the same in high school and elementary school in the Philippines, where the private sector is like fee generating, and then the public schools are low cost, low quality. And I guess the idea is thinking about the political economy of higher education versus the political economy of earlier stages of education. And it's good that it's in discussion rather than in like this is not our empirical data. But really, I was trying to reflect that question. I really think that why did the Philippines do this rather than an election promise? And I think it's really about, I was inspired by one of the slides in Thandi's lecture about the opportunity to loot. And these are about like the opportunity of politicians at different levels to loot. And that system is already, I think, institutionalized at the earlier levels, right? Like, I mean, the Philippines has a constitutional mandate as well to devote the largest section of its budget to education after debt service. So education is the largest item on the agenda. On the budget, and that's distributed. Sylvie spoke a little bit about the political system in the Philippines. That's distributed via congressional seats. We have a term for it. Maybe it's used in other countries as well. I mean, this distribution is literally called the pork barrel. It is practically called like the opportunity for the local congressman to be fat. You know what I mean? And that is already institutional in the education system. So there's no concern at the elementary and high school level in the public school system for quality. You just keep on processing people, regardless of education outcomes, to the next, because the money just needs to flow. But that didn't exist in higher education, because not everyone goes to higher education. And my view there is that the problems that you pointed out, like these inequalities in higher education exist in in secondary education as well. So those people who are in the public high school and public elementary school system are also not getting like good education or good educational outcomes, and will not probably get good jobs because of that embedded political economy in secondary education that is now being extended into higher education. So now, in my view, I think congressmen now have the ability, like it's not something that we tested, but my hypothesis is that now that it's free, now higher education is free, every congressman will, or congressperson, will want a state and university college in his or her district, because it will be a way to channel those, to acquire those, appropriate those funds that they already do at the earlier levels of education. Sorry, does that, so it doesn't, it help, in my mind, it links the earlier systems to the latter systems and the kind of outcomes in those systems, but maybe it's not the possibly a journey.
Oh, just on South Africa, yeah. I mean, I mean, we have probably one of the biggest education, but proportionally, we have one of the biggest expenditures on education in the world. And I think that the expenditure on primary and secondary, and at least the investment in transforming primary and secondary education, has been sufficient enough to change the demographics of higher education, in the sense that they now more or less match the demographics of the country, where they didn't before. So you had very upper middle class whites and Indian access to higher education, and very few African and colored students. These are our sort of racial groups that we still track, but it's still very, very unequal. So the vast majority of poor students will not get access to the level of quality of schooling to be able to access higher education. And the problem that we have is that we also, as much as we have it in policy, we don't have enough capacity growth in the vocational education sector and in the skills development space, and also what we now call community education, but is essentially based off adult basic education for people who, you know, essentially didn't finish school. So it's still highly unequal. So the demographics have changed, and it's been relatively successful changing higher education in terms of who accesses, but it's not enough, because the rest of the education system is still so unequal. So, and we've taken money away from basic education actually to fund this particular scheme. But now, luckily, so the shift over the last 5 years has been towards investing much more in foundational education and early childhood development, which is long, long overdue. So that will probably start shifting some of the debates and maybe make it easier to get a more sustainable scheme.
Daniel?
Thank you so much for the panel. Very fascinating. And I just want to follow up on Maya's question, because I don't research financing students, but I'm wondering if we're selling it more as a just kind of golden bullet that will solve both solution in like social mobility afterwards on the labor market, and in inequalities of access to quality education and before the fact. So, you know, as a corrective device after you had bad primary schooling, bad secondary schooling, and all of these things. So if we expect too much, in a sense, from you know, free tuition, and then when we show all of these problems, we basically make a case against it and throw the baby with the bathwater, you know, because and I'm speaking also from personal experience, being like kind of first generation students, low socioeconomic status. For me, I took a loan in England, very risk adverse, but just because you know, the law said that I would have to make a particular amount of money, and I thought I will never make that money, so they will never come after me, let's say. That was my aim in life, to never make this amount of money. And that's the only reason I took it. And for very many years, 10 years, because I was continuous education, I didn't make it. So in that sense, you know, like also like kind of the timeline, you know, when are we looking for these outcomes to occur? And who are we comparing with? Like, what about if we're comparing with our own life trajectories? You know, I would have been somewhere completely different if I wouldn't benefit from this kind of provisions, let's say. So yeah, I'm wondering if it could work, free tuition both in the future and in the past, to solve all the other structural issues we have in our society.
I'll take a second question. Yes, go, and then they answer, and then two more.
Thanks very much. My question is directed to the colleagues who presented on the Philippines. I'm really curious because as Thandi has outlined in South Africa, the issue of free higher education as qualified was highly contested. And one of the arguments was around, should you give middle class students access to free higher education instead of supporting the higher education system in some way? So I'm curious about, what the political imperative around that was. Was it around employability and issues related to the labor market? The second issue is that is in the Philippines, is education free from ECD to K-12? Is education free from the starting point?
Yeah, the public system.
In the public system. And then the point you made around, which people have written about, is the counterintuitive thing that in fact free higher education benefits the middle class students. And I wondered how that fitted in with sort of the social justice and the redistributive justice arguments that you presented. And where does that leave working class students? Are there alternative pathways for students who are not getting into higher education? Is there a developed and vibrant, vocational training sector?
You want to start first?
Sure. So there was a debate around the time of the implementation of the original Act about was this going to be benefiting middle class students. That was a critique that was made at the time, and it was effectively argued that the benefits outweighed that potential risk, that it would still benefit a large number of poorest of the poor was the used. Was it about employability? Partly, but I think the dominant narrative was more about sustainable development and about lifting the whole Philippine society.
Yeah, sorry, just on that point. So that's an outcome that, as I said, it's not our direct research. So we've gathered that evidence from the work of others. So, but that was not seen as a concern that, the middle class will benefit. I mean, it's in the public debate now, but again, despite that being the public debate, that the ones who are benefiting are these like middle class or upper class students who benefit mostly from private higher education and then who go on to the elite state universities for free. Despite that, as Sylvie mentioned, there's still widespread societal and legislative support for this empirical answer. Just to Daniela very quickly to say, yes, I mean, the legislative text presented it as like a big solution to this knowledge economy discourse, right? Like, we have a big young population and educating all of them will be glorious days ahead for the country. So that's the quick answer to the question. It's not a fee-based, it's not a loan-based system, so it doesn't speak to the second part of your question.
Yeah. Reflections on the question about institution-free policies capable to create more equal societies. I think this expectation that changing just one aspect of the higher education system will manage to create an equal society, which I think is beautiful for the debate, but it's unfair to evaluate policy outcome. Because of course, I mean, it's just one element of the entire higher education system. Now, I would like to reflect about a few things that the tuition-free policy of Chile solved. First one was the problem of upfront cost, and also the later cost, because if you study for free, you are not worried about your debt in the future, and that means that all the incomes that you get go to your life project, so you can buy your house freely. You don't have problem. Now, the experience, however, in the country with the process of market massification, that it works in terms of access. We have more institutions, more people going to higher education. But the problem is the outcomes of that massification and really unfair. And I would say that the market development process that we have in Chile just stratify our society even more. So we have more unequal society. It's true that the people who manage to access higher education for first generation are doing well than their parents. But it's not necessarily true that the second generation of middle classes that access to higher education do well because they are in debt, for example. So tuition-free help a little bit with that. But however, it's not solving the problem of private provision. So we have a student study for free, but going degrees with low value, low employment. That is not necessarily a problem of the policy itself, but actually the difficulties that
different governments have had to know how to do with the inequalities produced by marketization in the sector, not just in higher education, but also in other sectors of education. So that is, I think, part of a bigger debate, I would say, at least in Chile, the question for the last 2 decades is how we manage to build a proper welfare state, which includes some level of tuition-free policy, but it's not the only solution that we need to consider. And there's many other aspects. So I think when we evaluate, I totally agree with you, we should be more cautious about considering positive impacts and lessons of this policy innovation, but always thinking that building a more equal society requires more than just
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. In none of these countries right now, and some of them have had free tuition since 2008, we heard a wonderful success story of access to higher education being actually and seriously improved by a free tuition policy. And even the free tuition policy itself, and you saw that there are like lots of like fine prints, and even the application process sometimes are deterrents to getting access to it and getting access to higher education. And as Maya said, there's much more to do in terms of access. So that's just like one bandage kind of on one part of the access puzzle that is much, much bigger indeed. But it's an easy one politically to win and a very visible and appreciated policy, I would say. We had questions here and here.
My question was actually related to what you just answered about the feasibility of free tuition policy to solve the inequalities in society. I come from a law background, so I have a human rights lens to which I look at higher education, and just opening up the debate to the fact that the right to higher education is more than just the certificate is what leads to socioeconomic mobility in an ideal economy. But as you pointed out, there's so many challenges, as Professor Thandi pointed that even in South Africa, there's still a very high level of unemployment amongst graduates. And the right to higher education also includes quality, access, the right to the full development of the human personality, the rights respecting learning, meaning that the learning environment needs to be conducive. And so maybe at some point, policy stakeholders need to pause and just consider the full breadth of what a student is entitled to whilst they are still in education in the university. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Who had the question here? Maybe, and then we're taking this question. I think that's going to be it. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the panel. I think that's the question. So I just have, potentially I'm going to say some of the questions have been asked right now, but it struck me really something odd on Twente and in Thandi's presentation that the VAT tax has been increased to pay for this policy. So segregated tax, someone goes to pay for food and then they pay extra because there is free higher education for people very often from middle income kind of backgrounds. So I was just wondering if you could speculate a little bit about why this kind of concern for inclusivity of free higher education hasn't even entered the public debate to the extent that it should have entered probably. So that's one question. And another question is about maintenance support. So, I mean, this is about free higher education, but obviously there are many more costs of higher education, especially considered have to move out of their place of residence to attend university. And I know that in many of these cases, maintenance support is not available to the extent that it should be. So also, why is it, as you think, that this debate about maintenance support has not entered public debate in general? So why wasn't the debate about saying let's make the higher education truly free for those that need it the most? Yeah.
Thank you. Question here. Yeah.
Thank you. I also had a question for Thandi. Thandi, the block grants have been decreasing quite substantially. And I was wondering, has the government tracked the quality of the education? Has it decreased because of the decrease in the block grants?
Okay. I mean, I don't know if I can give a an assessment of that. I think that the universities are under extreme pressure because, so the block grants have been increasing, but the real growth in the university budget is below inflation. So because all of the money that's been increasing has been going into the student financial aid budget, I mean, essentially the universities are under more and more strain. And also because they lose so much of their tuition fee income to debt, student debt as well. So I mean, inevitably that does have a pressure on the quality, but it doesn't seem to have. I mean, I don't know what the independent quality measure would be, but there's still massive demand for higher education and totally oversubscribed public sector. So much so that the public, and because the public sector is constrained by enrollment growth, which is controlled by more or less controlled between the state and institutions. The big growth has been in the private, the higher education sector. So we, like everywhere else in the world, growing at about 7-8% per annum in the private sector, so that it's now more than 25% of the enrollments are in private institutions. So the shape of the system has changed quite a lot as well. These are sort of partly global trends and partly also local realities, is that we can't provide enough space in the public sector to meet demand, and the school improvements have been such that we can't, more and more students are doing well. So I think that's really the issue. I wouldn't say that quality is going down, but universities are really constrained, and growth is really constrained because universities have maintenance budgets that they can't really maintain existing infrastructure, but also the growth of infrastructure is constrained. And the real pressure we are under, which is also the same in all other countries, is to what extent can digital and technological developments assist in providing expansion and greater access to higher education, but how do you do that and ensure quality at the same time? So that's kind of the big debate that we're facing at the moment, and we're sort of being led in a sense by things that are happening in the market rather than planning. I think the point that I would want to make is, I mean, there's no doubt in South Africa that our policy has been incredibly successful because of how many thousands of young people have had access to higher education when they wouldn't have had. But we haven't really shifted the underlying debate, the point that I was making about whether higher education access should be a public good, whether it should be free, and if so, what should it cost? But I think the biggest problem that we face as a government now is how we plan as a government, because we're tending to be driven by these short-term ad hoc decisions that get made in certain sectors, rather than planning for an education system in a holistic way, looking at where the social support funding should go, where the education funding should go, and actually matching that up. So we tend to be driven by short-term ad hoc decisions rather than long-term planning, and I'm sure there are many countries that are in similar situations.
About the point on maintenance support, it's also striking to me that I think the politicization of tuition fees is such that it's kind of that we don't talk enough about maintenance, and the cost of living in most places for students is higher than tuition fees, and yet tuition fees get talked about much more. And I think that's the first issue. And the second issue, I think, is about loans and loans for maintenance. I think I have to research that because I don't have a really evidence for that, but I think there might be for students different acceptability level for loans depending on what they're for, and whether we don't know whether it's more acceptable for them to take them for tuition fees or for maintenance. And there might be, especially for low-income students who are quite debt adverse, more rejections of maintenance, cost of living, and so making choices to live at home or things like that, because that it seems to them kind of less acceptable to live on debt compared to the debt that would pay for their higher education. But I think that's also a debate that needs to happen. What is acceptable? Anyone wants to comment?
Just a very quick word about
challenge. And one of the things that is striking about the Philippines Act, or at least the phrasing of the legislative text, is that there is rights first terminology. It's a right to access quality education at all levels. What's challenging is the implementation. So because there has been a budget deficit, which is largely to do with the technicality about not predicting the increase in numbers who would want to take it up next year, what's happening is that universities are effectively getting their money too late, and based on the previous year's registration figures rather than current year's registration figures, which means that effectively, a lot of block grants and terminology used in the context, it's effectively the same thing where the money is coming from the tuition fee replacement rather than from block grants, which compromises universities' ability to invest in their infrastructure, as we were saying, and raises concerns about quality of delivery as well. So I think there's a question about, is the free tuition the right mechanism to ensure the right to access good higher education? I think the way that it's being implemented now is not necessarily accomplishing that vision.
Yeah.
Thank you. Short, yeah, we're standing between them and lunch.
Well, briefly, just to say that, like, I mean, regarding some of the colleagues in the questions there about like, oh, why don't people protest? You know, if they're using that to do this, it's, you know, only middle class people are So I think of the work of Jonas Stier, who is an educational anthropologist who talks about dogmas in education. And one of the dogmas he outlines in his book is educationism. And dogmas are just asymptotic truths, right? Like the idea that more education is good. Education is the highest good, right? Like education is the solution to all problems. And I think in certain societies that has taken hold. So no matter the cost, right? Like this is a good thing, right? And even if, you know, like middle class people, it's worth it, you know, to educate more people, right? Like we should pay this cost. And as I said, it is interesting reflecting on the Philippines, where there's this constitutional commitment to have that as the largest budget. And why is that the case, right? There must be some sort of belief system that codes for this kind of behavior. And yeah, just to say that, you know, like to examine also the societal beliefs about that when we discuss what the debate will be.
I think as we learn about this experience with innovation, also we need to remember and learn about some lessons from the global north. These countries teach us a lot about how we can actually social welfare and investment, distributive policies that include some level of tuition-free policies, along with free health, and also progressive tax system. And I think discussing tuition-free policy alone without this right perspective, but also attached to a discussion on our current political economy, is a limitation. So also we need to include that as a part of a wider debate about how we build equal society.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for the discussion, the comments, and just listening to us. And we'll let you go to lunch.